Good morning and welcome to this month's sustainability webinar. Now, this month we're looking at setting carbon targets and developing a decarbonisation strategy. It's amazing how many people have been asking me over the last couple of days about carbon targets, when one should set targets, whether one should publish that internally and externally, how does it link with IFRS S2, and also how do we develop an appropriate decarbonisation strategy. So here we've got a webinar addressing all those issues. So welcome to this webinar. As always, you know Aletta Boshoff, National Leader for Sustainability, and also IFRS and Corporate Reporting. I should say, usually these sustainability webinars are presented by myself and Kevin Frobus. Unfortunately, Kevin and I are both double booked, and we had to decide who's doing what. And I'm the lucky winner of the webinar, and he has to do a client meeting. Then acknowledgement of country, we would like to begin, or I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay our respects to elders past and present. And we extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here today. Now, if you look at these sustainability webinars, we have scheduled 12 for this year. We've already had 4. Very importantly, last month we looked at understanding carbon accounting and why it's important. And today we're following that up with setting carbon targets and developing a decarbonisation strategy. Next month in June, we'll be looking at the role of voluntary and mandatory sustainability reporting. Maybe a bit of an update. The AASB have in their exposure draft previously indicated that they'll only mandate climate reporting, and they were proposing to make some changes to IFRS S2 for the Australian environment. At their recent meeting, they indicated that they are reconsidering that approach and that they're considering to also bring IFRS S1 into the Australian environment, potentially on a voluntary basis initially, and then keep IFRS S2 mandatory. But they've heard loud and clear the message that they should not deviate from global standards, because a lot of Australian entities, when they comply with Australian standards, also automatically want to be in compliance with global standards. So I'm really excited about that. I believe IFRS S1 and S2 should be exactly the same in Australia as it is globally, to help us to meet global compliance. IFRS S1 is mandatory across the globe, but if we at least make it available in Australia for voluntary adoption for those entities who want to do compliance in Australia and globally, I think that would be a good first step. So we look at that in great detail next month, voluntary and mandatory reporting, which will be a combination of IFRS S1 voluntary and IFRS S2 mandatory. And then in July, we move on to some other topics where we look at climate-related risks and opportunities. So that's an overview of our webinars for the rest of this year. And if you've missed any of these webinars, you can go on our website, you can watch the recordings, you can download the slides. Actually, the sustainability webinars that we've presented over the last 3 years are available on our website. Then carbon accounting masterclasses. What a fun experience to meet so many of our normal webinar attendees. So many people have said, Aletta, we watch your webinars, lovely to meet you in person. So we've been running these sessions across the country. I'm actually currently still in Brisbane, ran the masterclass yesterday in Brisbane. And next stop for me is Perth. So on Friday, we're running the masterclass in our Perth office. If you've missed any of these face-to-face masterclasses, but you would like to still attend, there's a virtual masterclass option for Friday, the 7th of June. So that will be the last option this financial year for carbon accounting masterclasses. The carbon accounting masterclasses, we've been looking at boundary setting, we've been looking at measuring scope 1 and 2, we've been looking at measuring scope 3 across all 15 categories. We had 26 worked examples that we looked at, so there's a lot of information and material included in these masterclasses. And Sydney, Kevin presented the masterclass in Sydney last week with me as well. We also do monthly IFRS and corporate reporting webinars. So last week we looked at an update on financial and sustainability reporting for 30 June 2024, which in summary is, please have a look at the TCFD recommendations. ASIC has the TCFD recommendations and climate-related disclosures as a focus area for 30 June 2024. So don't wait for mandatory reporting. ASIC, ASX, APRA, regulators are already saying we strongly encourage you to comply with the TCFD recommendations as far as possible for 30 June 2024. So that's a bit of a reminder of that as well. Then today's agenda, very short agenda today. We are first of all looking at why are we setting carbon targets? Secondly, the steps in setting a greenhouse gas target. And then the third thing, something we haven't covered in the past, and that is to develop a base year recalculation policy. So if you've got a base year for your carbon footprint and certain changes happen in your business after that base year, potentially you have to recalculate that base year. So let's consider what that policy might look like and what the greenhouse gas protocols say about that. Then I also have a section on illustrative examples of actions to reduce scope 3 emissions. So in the greenhouse gas protocol, in their guidance around scope 3, hidden away towards the back, they have some illustrative examples on how entities can reduce scope 3 emissions. And I will refer to those in today's webinar. And then finally, how BDO can help you. And our services, advisory services across carbon accounting, climate-related disclosures or IFRS S2, and then also broader strategy, voluntary reporting, so IFRS S1. So those are the three streams. And obviously, if you're an audit client or not, and you need assurance over sustainability information, our audit partners and teams can help with that as well. So that's our high-level agenda for today. So why are we setting carbon targets? Now, interesting, over the past few weeks when we've been running these master classes, we've been talking about some frustrations that we, particularly as accountants, have with the greenhouse gas protocol. And our frustration is often around the fact that the greenhouse gas protocol is quite loosely drafted, not as tightly drafted as my beloved IFRS accounting standards. And that often gives us this idea of how accurate can it be, different people can do different things, etc. And I think it's important to understand, if we stand back, the greenhouse gas protocol, many, many years ago, when it was developed, was mainly developed for entities to come up with a baseline of their carbon footprint and to investigate and implement decarbonisation strategies. So the main focus has never been to have reporting under IFRS S2 in an annual report with all the scrutiny that we are expecting in coming years. So one could see that at a more conceptual level, that could be the reason why the greenhouse protocol in the past have not been drafted particularly tightly, because it was all about, let's get a carbon footprint. Even if it is a lot of estimation, let's get a carbon footprint, but very importantly, let's think about setting targets, and let's think about reducing our carbon footprint. Let's think about decarbonisation strategy. Now, as you all know, that's very different to what we have with IFRS accounting standards. And even though those standards are principles-based, they have very tightly drafted requirements because it ends up in a financial report, it ends up in an annual report going to investors, a lot of scrutiny. We need credible information. So the interesting thing here is that the World Resources Institute that develops and maintains the greenhouse gas protocol have started a project to update the greenhouse gas protocol because it will now end up in so many reports that they want to tighten the drafting. And also accounting standards have changed so much over the last 15 to 20 years, and the greenhouse gas protocol has not been updated to reflect those changes. And the most important one there is leases, IFRS 16. So the greenhouse gas protocol currently talk about leases as if it's still an operating lease expense, and where we now know that IFRS 16 brings those leases on the balance sheet as a right of use asset. So why are we setting carbon targets? Because ultimately we want to reduce our carbon footprint and we want to decarbonize. Now, you cannot set a target if you haven't measured your carbon footprint initially. And what we've said previously, that in Australia, we are subject, or currently it looks as if we'll be subject to 2 measurement frameworks. I'm saying it looks like because the AASB in their exposure draft IFRS S2 refers to the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting NGES scheme, and where the NGES scheme is not dealing with a particular situation, for example, scope 3 emissions, the NGES scheme to be supplemented by the greenhouse gas protocol. We know globally IFRS S2 only refers to the greenhouse gas protocol. So not sure where the AASB is going to land, but at the moment it looks like we'll have the 2 measurement frameworks. Now, with those 2 measurement frameworks, important when we go on this journey is we need a baseline. We need a baseline footprint, and then we have to recalculate that baseline each and every year in order to see whether we are reducing our footprint. It's important once you've got a baseline to think about what would be a realistic target and then to track performance against that target. So if you measure your carbon emissions and to come up with a baseline, at BDO we've got 3 phases. You look at boundary setting. Secondly, you look at scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then we look at scope 3 emissions. Now, boundary setting, incredibly important to document which entities are within the organizational boundary, what consolidation approach you use, and also important to think about operational boundaries, so whether we've got scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and how does it fit together. Now, yesterday in the masterclass, we've again articulated incredibly important when you do your boundary setting to not just focus on the organizational boundary setting, but to also look at operational boundaries, and not just look at operational boundaries, what is in scope 1 and 2, but fully explore the rest of your boundary, operational boundary, as in scope 3. Because often once you work through all the 15 categories of scope 3, you start to think of, oh, I missed this, it should have been scope 1, or maybe this is scope 2. So you cannot really have any, I would say, complete scope 1 and 2 boundary unless you've really considered all your activities across all the scopes. So that's a bit of a tip. In the second phase, we start by just looking at measuring scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And the reason we do that is those 2 scopes will be mandatorily reported under IFRS S2 in the first year that you adopt IFRS S2. And then in the second year, you also have to mandatorily report scope 3. So there's a little bit more focus on scope 1 and 2 a year earlier than scope 3. The other thing is scope 1, you've got some ability to change and you have some control over your scope 1. And you can decide on whether you use fossil fuels or not. Where in scope 2, again, you have some choice on whether you buy electricity, whether you buy renewable energy, etc. So scope 1 and 2, somewhat an ability for you to make an impact and make an impact very quickly. When you go to phase 3 and you look at scope 3 emissions, so this is the whole value chain. So this looks at all your suppliers and all your customers. So we look from cradle to grave of various products and services. Really hard. It's not necessarily under your control. You can try and influence, you can try and encourage. So a harder one to decarbonize. Scope 3, harder to decarbonize because not under your direct control. So those are the 3 phases to come up with a baseline footprint. Now, once you've done your baseline footprint, and to make sure you haven't missed anything, I would do it across all these categories. So basically, you can see in total there's 20 categories. Because in scope 1, we've got the 4 categories: mobile combustion, stationary combustion, chemical and industrial processing, and fugitive emissions. Then in scope 2, we've got purchase, electricity, heat, cooling, and steam. So that's another category. And then in scope 3, we've got 8 upstream categories and 7 downstream categories. So important, once you've got a baseline across all of these, you would be able to identify which category makes up the biggest part of your carbon footprint. So if you just do scope 1 and 2, you might look at those and say, oh, electricity is the biggest one, let's focus on that. However, if you look at scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 collectively, maybe purchased electricity is not your biggest problem. Maybe the biggest problem is capital goods, or maybe the biggest problem is business travel. So I think doing a baseline across all 20 categories give you a really good indication of which categories would be more problematic and more urgent to decarbonize, which categories you more urgently need better data, better calculation methodologies. So again, to just look at scope 1 and 2, although maybe that's the easier ones, scope 3, to include scope 3, will give you a better visibility across your whole carbon footprint. As I've said in previous webinars, if you look at BDO Australia's 2023 Sustainability Report, our carbon footprint, scope 1 is negligible, scope 2 is 3%, and scope 3 in total is 97%. And category 1, actually, scope 3 category 1, apologies, is around 82%. Therefore, for us, even though it's hard to move the dial on scope 3 category 1, surely that would be our focus because it's 82% of our footprint. So important to have a baseline across all the scopes so you can identify material, significant categories to focus your target setting and decarbonisation strategy on. So after you've done your greenhouse gas inventory or your carbon footprint, you know, a reduction target and a reduction strategy is the logical follow-up once you've developed an inventory, a carbon inventory. So I think really important. So why would you set a target? So, you know, if we've got a baseline footprint, to just say we're going to reduce it, and we're going to reduce it over time, and we're going to monitor and track it, not necessarily the most effective way. Important to say this is our baseline, knowing our business. What would a realistic target be so we can focus on it? It's similar to if we don't have a KPI, if we don't have career goals, really hard to achieve them. Yes, you do your best, but do you have a KPI? Do you have a goal? Do you have a target? So why would we set a greenhouse gas target? It helps ensure that an issue is kept on senior management's radar screen, so it keeps in focus. We know senior management have a lot of important things to focus on, but if there's no clear target and KPI, there might always be something else to focus on instead and, get more attention. It's also important that if we've got a target, it helps ensure that an issue is factored into relevant decisions about what products and services we want to provide, what materials and technology we want to use. Also, if we have a target, it will help with minimizing and managing greenhouse gas risks. It helps us achieving cost savings and stimulate innovation. It would help us to prepare for future regulations like IFRS S2, because IFRS S2 will mandate that organizations set and report in their mandatory sustainability report, in the annual report, their greenhouse gas target. And then also it will demonstrate leadership and corporate responsibility and participating in voluntary programs. Now, I often get asked, now that we've got a baseline, should we report our target? I would say if you've got a baseline, a baseline across scopes 1, 2, and 3, you should set a target. Would I put that in an external publication? Would I put it on the website? I would say possibly not. I would put it on the website in a publication, in a report, if it's either mandated to do or if there's a strategic reason to do it. Once it's mandated or there's a strategic reason to do it, remember, you put a target out there, you get measured against that target. The question will come, okay, you've got a target, looks very ambitious. What are your plans? You cannot have a target in a public domain if you don't have a plan that you could realistically achieve that target. That is incredibly important. If you put a target out there without a plan to realistically achieve that target in the set time frame, that would be greenwashing, right? So we need a plan. Very important to have a plan. So steps in setting a greenhouse gas target. Now, I've previously covered some of this, but I wanted to recap it before we look at some decarbonisation strategies. So, when we look at determining a baseline, but also setting targets, always go back to our greenhouse gas protocol publications, and there's a link to the protocol there. Now, as set out in the greenhouse gas protocol, 10 steps to set a greenhouse gas target. And I would work through these methodically and document every step of the way. Because if we get quizzed, how did you come up with a target, which you've put in the public domain? This was our approach as established by the greenhouse gas protocol. This was our thinking for every step. And now that we've got a target, these are our plans to actually achieve the target. So just meeting these steps is one part of it, but to actually have plans to reduce your carbon footprint and to decarbonize is the next level, which is incredibly important. So step 1, to obtain senior management commitment. We know that nothing happens in an organization without board and senior management support. We need the CEO to be across this. We need the CEO to support this. Incredibly important. It's only if they support it and they're across it that it would impact our, that it's achievable to do this. Sorry, I just want to move something. Today I only have one screen because I am not at home or in the office, or at my desk. I'm in the Brisbane office, in the meeting room, one screen, and sometimes things pop up on this one screen. So apologies for that. So if we want to get changes in behavior and decision making, definitely we need senior management buy-in. They can help us with internal accountability, implement incentive systems, and make sure we've got adequate resources. So it would be really difficult, I would say somewhat impossible, to get targets and carbon reduction without senior management buy-in. So that's step one. In step two, we look at deciding on our target type. So there are two broad types of greenhouse gas targets that you can set. It could be an absolute target, or it could be an intensity-based target. So an absolute target is usually a target that we've got our tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and we want to reduce our total tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 50% or 30%, etc. An intensity target is usually expressed as a reduction in the ratio of our greenhouse gas emissions relative to another business metric. So, for example, again, if I use BDO Australia as an example, we've done our carbon footprint, and I think our footprint on memory is around 26,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. But we've also worked out and disclosed some intensity factors. So we worked out our carbon per $1 million of revenue. So that's an intensity factor. And we've worked out our carbon per full-time equivalent employee. And now the question is, do we want to set a target as an absolute target to reduce the 26,000 tons, or do we want to reduce our intensity factor? So that is the intensity per $1 million of revenue or intensity per full-time equivalent. Some of the reasons why you would look at an intensity target would be if your organization is going through significant organic growth. So there's a lot of organic growth, increase in revenue, increase in staff numbers as a result of organic growth. It's going to be really difficult to reduce your absolute target. Maybe the best way to think is that how can we reduce our intensity target in that situation? So then also, you know, some companies have both an absolute and an intensity target. Maybe the absolute target is not as aggressive as an intensity target to get some balance overall. Again, here I've tried to articulate some advantages of absolute targets and some disadvantages of absolute targets. So, you know, I think one of the big disadvantages is that your target-based year has to be recalculated for significant structural changes to the organization, and it adds complexity to tracking progress over time. You know, so there is some difficulty there. So this is a little bit of an overview of absolute targets, advantages, disadvantages, and again with intensity targets, advantages, disadvantages. So advantages would reflect the GHG performance improvements independent of organic growth or decline. So again, if your organization is expecting or is going through significant organic growth or decline, that would be a good one for you to look at. Target year recalculations for structural changes are usually not required, and it might increase the comparability of GHG performance across various companies in the same industry. For example, very hard to just compare your baseline with another company. If you've got an intensity factor and an intensity target, somewhat easier to get to comparability. Step 3 is to decide on a target boundary. So your target boundary is looking at, you know, which greenhouse gases you'll cover, which geographical operations we look at, which direct and indirect emission sources will be addressed. So will we only look at direct emissions scope 1, or will we also look at indirect emissions, and will we just look at scope 2, or we're looking at scope 3 as well, and in particular, all those scope 3 categories, which ones are we focusing on? Do we want targets for the whole carbon footprint, or do we want to put specific targets on particular categories? So you can also have separate targets for different types of businesses within your group. So if you've got a big group and you know that certain entities and the manufacturing, let's say, of certain products have a higher carbon intensity, and you want to really motivate them to do something about that, you can have targets for particular companies, divisions, products. So how do you want to set your target boundary? So, you know, organizations may set a variety of reduction targets. So some would say we have a single target for scope 1 and 2. You often see it at the moment where entities say we're going to be net zero. Please read the fine print. Do they want to be net zero across scope 1 and 2, or net zero across all 3 scopes? Because sometimes it's quite big net zero, but the fine print says across scope 1 and 2. So have a look at that. So do you want to be net zero across scope 1 and 2, or do you want a single target, have a reduction of, let's say, 20% across all 3 scopes? Or do you just want a target for scope 3? Do you want separate targets for individual categories within scope 3? Or is it a combination of targets? So there's an overall target for scope 1, 2, and 3, but there's very specific targets for separate locations or separate categories. So targets can be what is best for your organization in order to achieve proper decarbonisation. So it's not a one target fit all businesses, all industries, and you've got the ability to set your target fit for purpose for your business. Choose the target base year. Again, you could have 2 approaches here. You could have a fixed target base year, or you could have a year or a rolling target based year. Important to consider which one you want to use. A lot of organizations have a single base year. So it just simplifies emissions tracking. So if BDO Australia's base year is 2022, so everything is compared over time with 2022. It avoids cherry picking of base years. So, you know, you don't want a base year 2022, let's say for scope 1 and 2, and 2024 is your base year for scope 3. It's easier if it's the same year. Now you can think, if you're going to do scope 1 and 2 first, and the next year you're going to add scope 3, you might have to use the second year that you've calculated scope 1 and 2 as the base year for your target, because that's the first year that you've got scope 1, 2, and 3 calculated. So again, consider that. A little bit hard to articulate. Scope 1 and 2, our base year is X, and for scope 3, our base year is Y. It's possible, just harder to communicate and track. And this is complicated already, so I believe in simplifying. So again, what we've tried to do here is a little bit of a comparison between the fixed target base year and a rolling target base year. So, you know, if it's a fixed target base year, how might we set that target? We would say we will emit X% less in year B than in year A. So we'll emit 50% less in the year 2030 than in the year 2020, for example. A rolling target base year could be over the next 5 years, we will reduce emissions every year by 10% compared to the previous year. Right, so with a fixed target year, you've got a fixed reference year in the past. With a rolling target year, your reference point is just the previous year. And then we've got some other differences between how far back is like with like comparison possible, and what is the basis for comparing emissions between the target year and the completion year. To give you some further information. Again, here we're continuing the comparison across how far back are recalculations made, how reliable is it, and when recalculations are made. So again, you can look at these two slides, compare fixed target base year with rolling target base year, and that would inform your decision on which one you would see as the most appropriate. In step 5, we look at define the target completion date. So the target completion date determines whether your target is relatively short-term or longer term. So long-term targets facilitate long-term planning for large-scale capital investments with greenhouse gas benefits. However, they might encourage later phase outs of less efficient equipment. So if you focus on a longer term target, it might delay your decarbonisation activities because people say, oh, we've got a longer time to get there. The other thing with long-term targets, it does depend on uncertain future developments. There could be some opportunities as well. Sometimes longer-term targets would be appropriate if you're in an industry where we're waiting for innovation, research and development, so we can get the appropriate technology to decarbonize, because we know in the short term there's no innovation or R&D that will be available to assist with decarbonization. So again, there's no right or wrong whether you use short-term or long-term. It is what makes sense for your business. A 5-year target period may be more practical for organizations with shorter planning cycles. So we know over the next 5 years, we have the innovation, we have the technology, we have a planning period just 5 years, and we can really do something over the short term. Then in step 6, we think about define the length of the target commitment period. So the target commitment period is the period during which the emissions is actually measured against the targets. And it ends with the target completion date. So one would hope that the target commitment period wouldn't mean the end of decarbonisation for an organisation. One would hope by that target commitment end date, people are so well advanced on decarbonisation that they continue to explore, that they continue to be mindful of this. But the length of that target commitment period does give us an indication of how the entity's level of commitment. Usually the longer the target commitment period, the longer the period during which emission performance counts toward a target. I know at the moment a lot of entities have fairly short periods for targets around scope 1 and 2, and then for targets around scope 3, a longer commitment period. Often because we need some time to be able to collaborate with suppliers and customers, and for all of this to flow through the economy, and also for technology and innovation to catch up. And then if we look at step 7, you have to think about, are we going to use offsets or carbon credits? A greenhouse gas target can be entirely met, by internal reductions, etc. And sometimes we cannot reduce it, so we have to buy offsets. Those cost of internal reductions in a business can be high. It could be that opportunities for reductions internally is quite limited. In certain industries, very limited at the moment, if you think about cement and steel and aluminium. And then, maybe the company is unable to meet its target because there's unexpected circumstances. So we've got a target, we're working towards it, but there's some obstacles. When we report on a target, it should be specified where the offsets are used and how much of the target reduction was achieved by using offsets. So you would disclose your carbon footprint and excluding any offsets. So this is my carbon footprint, and then below that, this is the offsets that I've purchased to get to a net footprint. And if you want to get to a net footprint of 0, if that's your target, you either have to get all your internal activities to be 0, or you have to say, this is my emissions, these are the offsets that I've used, and this is how I get to this net position of 0. So it's important to say, did we do it by being more efficient, effective, and having decarbonisation strategies using renewable energy, etc., or did we do our business as normal and we just ended up buying offsets? Now, those offsets are expensive, by the way, carbon credits. So it's not necessarily the best way to go. It's an expensive way to go. The other thing is the credibility of offsets. So it's important that we think about the credibility of the offsets that we use to meet our targets, and to specify the origin and the nature of the offsets when we report. So some of the information that you have to disclose is the type of project that created the offset that you bought, the geographic and organizational origin of the offset that you purchased, how the offsets have been quantified. So there's a very rigorous process to create and quantify an offset, and whether they've been recognized by external programs. So you don't want to buy offsets that's actually not being verified and recognized by external programs and therefore not reputable. So it's important to assess it for commercial reasons, but also to assess it because you'll have to disclose it and you want a reputable offset. Then if you look at establish a target double counting policy. So there's currently no real consensus on how double counting issues should be addressed. So entities should come up with a policy is how do we avoid double counting, and especially around setting targets. So this should specify how reductions and trades related to other targets and programs will be reconciled with their corporate target, and accordingly which types of double counting situations are regarded as irrelevant. So have some consideration for that. So also, double counting of offsets can occur when greenhouse gas offsets is counted towards the target by both the selling and the purchasing organization. So it's important that trading programs address this by using registries that allocate a serial number to all traded offsets or credits, and ensuring that serial numbers are retired once they're being used by a particular entity. So if we don't have this control around targets, we could have a problem that targets are being used by multiple companies. So the same offset being used by multiple companies. Then also there could be double counting due to target overlap. So this can occur when sources included under a company's corporate target are also subject to limits by an external program or another company's target. So just be mindful. Then decide on the target level. So you have to understand not just your carbon footprint, but the key drivers of your carbon footprint, because that will give you an idea of the opportunities you've got available to reduce your carbon footprint. If you just have your footprint, that's not good enough. What are the drivers of the items that end up in our carbon footprint? And again, then consider what are the opportunities to reduce or impact those drivers in order to get to a target. You should also look at growth factors. So what are the production plans, revenue or sales targets, return on investment, or things that would drive your investment strategy. So those growth factors should be factored in because it will have an impact on your target. And this is where intensity factor targets might be useful. Are there already plans in place for fuel switching, for on-site power generation, and or renewable energy investments? And have we done benchmarking with other similar organizations in our industry, for example? And then track and report progress, very important. To have a target and you're not tracking it, you're not reporting progress would mean nothing. So once we've set a target, we have to track performance against it, to check compliance in order to make it credible. And we have to report that. So it's really important that we have regular performance checks to link our target to our annual GHG inventory process and make sure that we're working towards achieving our target. When we look at reporting, remember reporting will be required under IFRS S2, but even the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is talking about this is the kind of information we would expect to be disclosed around targets. So what is the target boundary, the target type, the target base year, the completion date, the length of the commitment, all the 9 steps that we've basically talked through, document that and make it available as part of your external reporting. So we have transparent carbon footprint and transparent carbon targets. And then we could also include information, informations on emissions and the performance in relation to the target. So yes, this is our baseline footprint, these are our targets, and this is how we're progressing over time. So that's all about setting that target. So you've got a baseline, you've set a target, you've gone through the steps. I think something to also address is to develop a base year recalculation policy. So when would it be required for us to recalculate our base year emissions? So we've got a base year in a particular year, and we always compare our progress potentially against the base year. That's where we don't have a rolling base year. But is there a situation where we have to go back and recalculate the base year? So you need a policy. Before we look at that policy, just a bit of a reminder, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol include the following accounting and reporting principles around relevance, completeness, consistency, transparency, and accuracy. And when we're looking at recalculating our baseline, we're dealing with consistency. So consistency over time and transparency over time. So if we look at that policy or the recalculation policy, when should your base year emissions be recalculated? According to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, recalculating your base year emissions is necessary to maintain consistency and to make meaningful comparisons of your carbon inventory over time. You will require to recalculate your base year emissions when the following changes occur and have a significant impact on the inventory. So you've got structural changes in your reporting organization. So maybe you've had mergers, acquisitions, divestments, outsourcing or insourcing of certain activities. So structural changes, a big acquisition, we would say, hang on, my baseline is no longer an appropriate comparison. Because we've had this big acquisition, one would expect our emissions to be higher, and to compare this big group with the actual emissions of the big group today with the baseline emissions of a part of the group 10 years ago might not be the right thing to do. So we have to recalculate base year emissions. Another reason to recalculate base year is if there's changes in calculation methodologies, if there's improvements in data accuracy, or there's discovery of significant errors. Now, I would say, if you look at calculation methodologies and improvement in data accuracy, and we've explored this at length in our master classes, quite often you do a particular calculation methodology and you have certain data accuracy in your first year because it's the only data you have available. And therefore, you cannot necessarily recalculate your base year because you didn't have the data available. So it's not saying do it in those situations. But if the data was available, one could go back and redo the base year. And then also, you'll have to recalculate your base year if there's changes in the categories or activities that's included in your emissions inventory. Remember, we talk about continuous improvement. If we continually improve our data quality and continually improve our calculation methodologies as new information and technology become available, I'm not saying that you then have to recalculate your base year. However, structural changes is a big trigger for recalculating your base year. Otherwise, it's hard to compare with your targets. What we're trying to say is consider these things, consider whether it's possible and appropriate to recalculate your base year. It's important when you decide on your base year to also consider what is your policy around recalculation. When, according to your policy, will you go back and recalculate the base year? And that will depend on the significance of the changes. So you could have a qualitative or a quantitative threshold on when you're going to recalculate. So maybe it would be significant changes to the data, or significant changes to your inventory boundary, significant changes to your quantification or calculation methods, etc. So you could say a significant change could be defined as one that alters base year emissions by at least 10%. We're expected to change it by at least 10%, for example. So it's important to have that policy and to continuously monitor whether we should recalculate the base year, because it will really help you across measuring progress towards achieving your targets. And then companies have to apply that recalculation policy in a consistent manner. What if there's changes in calculation methodology, improvements in data accuracy? So I touched on this earlier. Often you've got more accurate data, and you've got new data points, and those data points and more accurate data was not available in the past. In that case, you will disclose that we didn't have the data in the past. We still want to use the more accurate data, but we clearly disclose that we've not updated and recalculated our baseline for whatever reason. So disclosure in order to achieve transparency. There's no recalculation required for organic growth or decline. So base year emissions and historic data are not recalculated for organic growth and decline, and that's why for organic growth or decline, it might be better to set a target around intensity. So, consider this again. If we expect organic growth, not set an absolute target because we won't be redoing the baseline. Instead, we're looking at intensity factors. So just a few things to consider. Finally, I would like to look at a few illustrative examples of actions to reduce Scope 3 emissions. So for example, Scope 3 emissions are really hard to reduce because you've got influence but not necessarily control. Again, upstream emissions, again, easier because at least it's your suppliers, and you can somewhat dictate what your suppliers have to do in order to continue to do business with you. Your customers, that's harder. You want customers. You want to grow your number of customers. You want to grow your number of sales. So a bit harder. But let's look at the first ones. If you want to look at decarbonizing Scope 3 emissions across Category 1, we replace high greenhouse gas emitting raw materials with maybe low GHG emitting raw materials if possible. We implement low GHG procurement or purchasing policies. We see this across many of our clients. We encourage your tier 1 suppliers, so that is your direct suppliers. You encourage them to engage with their direct suppliers in order to reduce their carbon footprint. So you're pushing it right through the whole value chain. And you disclose these Scope 3 emissions to the customers in order to propagate GHG reporting throughout the supply chain. So it's an education exercise, not just from you to your suppliers, but your suppliers to their suppliers. The first two, I see a lot in practice. Entities are considering, is there a way that we can replace high GHG emitting raw materials with low GHG emitting raw materials? Is there a way that we can implement low GHG procurements or purchasing policies, especially across services? If you look at capital goods, very similar to considering replacing high GHG emitting capital goods with low GHG emitting capital goods. If you look at category 3, fuel and energy related activities, those that are not included in scope 1 and 2. Scope 1 and 2, where you've got direct control over the fuel you use or the electricity you use. Here, it's different. So it's the actual extraction and transport of those, actually extraction of those fuel until it's on your property for you to use. So the way to reduce the related activities is to reduce your actual energy consumption from fossil fuels. You could change your energy source toward lower emitting fuels. And the other one is to generate energy on site using renewable sources. So you yourself generate the energy on site, importantly not from diesel, but from renewable sources. Another way to address that third one. What about upstream transportation and distribution? Reduce the distance between the supplier and the customer. Source materials locally if it leads to net GHG reductions. Optimize efficiency of transportation and distribution, including storage. Replace higher emitting transportation modes with lower emitting transportation modes. Shift towards lower emitting fuel sources being used in your vehicle, delivery trucks, etc. If you look at waste generated in operations, reduce the quantity of waste generated in operations. Consider recycling measures to reduce emissions and implement lower emitting waste treatment methods. So it's not reducing, it's not just reducing your actual emissions, but also reducing the emissions from waste treatment. If you look at business travel, reduce the amount of business travel. So what about video conferencing, web-based meetings, these webinars that we're doing, it's not in person. Encourage more efficient travel. Encourage lower emitting modes of travel, so rail instead of plane. I've heard that there are some entities in the UK that are saying we're no longer flying around, we're now traveling via train in order to reduce our carbon footprint. That's a bit harder in Australia, it's a bigger country, but I heard of that in the UK. If you look at employee commuting, reduce commuting distances. So maybe we need our offices and our facilities near urban centers or public transit facilities, so it's easier for employees to come by train. Create disincentives for commuting by car, so parking policies, parking costs. Provide incentives for the use of public transit, bicycles, carpooling. Implement teleworking or telecommuting programs. Reduce number of days worked per year, especially in the office. If you look at upstream leased assets, increase energy efficiency of operation, and shift towards lower emitting fuel resources. So upstream is easier. Now when we get to downstream, even harder, because this is now your customers. This is transportation and distribution of sold products. Again, reduce distance between the supplier and the customer, optimize efficiency of transportation distribution, replace high emitting transportation modes with lower emitting transportation modes, shift toward lower emitting fuel sources. If you look at processing of sold products, improve efficiency of processing, redesign products to reduce processing required, use lower GHG energy sources. Again, if you look at your use of sold products, so this is how your customers use your product, develop new low or zero emitting products. So you're selling products that are low emitting. Increase energy efficiency of energy consuming goods. Eliminate the need for energy use. Shift away from products that contain or emit GHG emissions, etc. So the use of your products. So it's kind of changing your products and improving your products and the way it's been used by customers. End of life treatment. Make products recyclable if it leads to net GHG reduction. So at the end of the life of your product, it doesn't go to landfill, it can be recycled. And how do we make that easy for customers? Packaging, implement product packaging measures that lead to reductions, implement recycling measures. So end of life treatment, very important. Downstream leased assets, so where we are the lessor, increase energy efficiency of our operations, so renewable energy at our new buildings, double glazed windows, etc. Shift towards lower emitting fuels. And then for franchises and investments, increase energy efficiency, lower emitting fuel resources, and investments, very important, invest in lower emitting investments, technologies, and projects. So just a few ideas to get you thinking about decarbonisation strategies across scope 3, which is very difficult, acknowledging that it is very difficult. So how BDO can help, as you know, we do a lot of work around carbon accounting, so we can help you to measure your carbon footprint. We can help you with sustainability reporting, whether it's voluntary or mandatory. We can help you with sustainability strategy, including decarbonisation strategy, and we can help you with sustainability assurance over your carbon footprint, your climate disclosures. So this is a little bit of expansion of our core services and the various people playing in the various spaces. And we've got our monthly sustainability news that came out last week, again on Friday, on our website, a lot of learning, e-learning. We've got a checklist to help you with sustainability roadmap, a TCFD checklist for your 30 June 2024 financial year, and there's some TCFD training online. Finally, I would like to say thank you very much for joining me today for this webinar. I'm looking forward to speaking to you again next month, and Kevin will be back next month. I hope you have a lovely day.